What is a seed oil? Are all seeds bad? If you don't actually know or distinguish between the seeds that we were designed to thrive off of versus the man-made aberrations that currently are in most of our food, then you won't actually regenerate or live longer. Without the nutrients that I'm going to cover today, you will not enhance your lifespan, and the trend of genetic degeneration in your family tree will sadly increase. Worst of all, you're going to waste tens of thousands of dollars on foods and supplements that do nothing to address the function in the human body of cellular nutrition, the function of producing and regulating hormones, energy, and more. Simply put, you won't get the good stuff into your cells where they actually become food. So how would you like to get maximum nutrient utilization from what you're already investing in and consuming? Are you intentional about the foods you eat? Then you want to make sure that you get the most out of them. Would you like to restore, as a man, the testosterone levels of 60 years ago and sustain it throughout the day? How would we all like to enhance our telomeres? These are the protein caps, if you've heard of them, on the ends of our cells that determine lifespan, cell division, epigenetic function, and other things. For the ladies, how would you like to reverse modern autoimmune conditions that have become all too common? Modern diseases like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, PCOS, endometriosis, and early menopause. Do you know that most languages don't even have a word for menopause because the transition was pain and symptom-free? What about mood swings, stamina, fertility? We want to reduce miscarriage, postpartum depression, and we ultimately just want to grow babies that have increased brain and nervous system development to their maximum potential, healthy hearts and lungs, maximum healthy gene expression, and the suppression of genetic things that could be passed on that are degenerative. Did you know that there are nutrients found in foods that actually prevent the passing on of chromosomal disorders and help increase the physical size and strength of our children? This is going to shock you, but the most important nutrient group that is most fundamentally responsible for these regenerative functions is found in true whole grains, not alone, and not in the carbs or the gluten of the grain, but in a 10% aspect of the grain where the true treasure is found. And this would be in synergy, of course, with a well-rounded, biblically based diet. In fact, these essential nutrients are not found in the parts of the grain where the carbohydrate is. They are inside of the endosperm. These are vital lipids and sterols on which both male and female bodies, they depend in order to build our hormone cascade. So if you've heard of different hormones like progesterone, then those are part of this cascade that needs to start with some fundamental building blocks that are supposed to come from our diet, manufactured within our bodies to create all of the different hormones that we need. And you also need complete protein and other nutrients to bring this about. But fundamentally, you need the right ratio of healthy fats. And this determines our mood, our energy, and like I said, our fertility. So in short, human existence has always depended upon these nutrients, and we need to get back to the days of heritage, genetically superior whole grains made from scratch. Let's enjoy fresh milled bread and sourdough pancakes while maintaining a lean figure. We're going to help you see how you can adapt to the modern world where we're primarily sedentary and we need to reduce a lot of our carbohydrates, most of us, and still get these really important nutrients. And we want you to walk away from this episode having a restored relationship with grains. We can make baked goods healthy again. Are you ready to be regenerated? Here we go. Now, most of us think about nutrition as the food we eat, but nutrition is actually determined by what our cells receive for proper growth and nourishment, immune function, and many other things. Greetings, regenerated family. I'm excited to be back with you for another episode where we're continuing our breakdown of biblical nutrition. We could call this the macros of regeneration. We've already talked about fruits and vegetables, antioxidants in the Edenic provision as the first foods that God gave us. There was some overlap there between vegetables and grains. Today, we're going to talk about the grain provision, as always, starting with what Scripture teaches us, but we're also going to see that the overwhelming testimony of history is that these were staples of large, healthy, sustainable civilizations. And then the next episode, we're going to cover the meat provision or protein. And you might be wondering, where are healthy fats in all of this? Well, they're going to be included in today's episode as well as the next episode because those come from both plant and animal sources. And the ones that we're going to talk about today are, if you're into keto or carnivore or healthy fats, these are going to be the ones that you've never heard of, but they're the most important, the most foundational. So focusing on the grain provision, the most important nutrients that you've never heard of is something that I'm particularly passionate about because this is the arena that's the least well understood in modern nutrition. Yet we've had evidence for decades, for over 70 years, why these are so critical. And it's the bedrock of ancient nutrition. I'm always hearing about ancestral eating and nutrition. And this is mostly from people who aren't taking into account how many different cultures there are around the world and large population studies. And they're also not taking into account a whole food perspective where the ones that thrived and had long lifestyles had a strong combination of all kinds of different food groups. They typically focus on smaller hunter-gatherer groups. And it's really built on a fundamentally flawed worldview that we used to be caveman and that was the optimal state of human beings. And meat is the best thing for us. And I'm not saying that it's not. Meat is amazing. And we're going to talk about that in the next episode. But before we get there, you need to know that true ancestral nutrition actually focused on, wait for it, grains. Before you tuck tail at the mention of whole grains and write it off as food pyramid propaganda, you need to be aware that there are many presuppositions going into this, some that I just mentioned. I want you to know that I'm not talking about modern processed grains or even a carb-centric diet. We can't live that way anymore because we've changed our lifestyles dramatically. We already have established what biblical nutrition is. And Mr. West, who again is reading our scripture references for this episode, he gave us a sneak peek into the historicity of this nutrient group in our previous episode, God's Plan for Good Nutrition. You can go back and listen to that if you want, but we're going to dive a little deeper today. Now, this is precisely why we need to understand definitions to the terms being used. We have to go back to our actual ancestors who were humans and get detailed accounts about what they ate in order to understand what is healthful for humans to eat in the long term. And then we need to look at what we've done to change the foods and how our modern processes and chemicals have influenced what God created good and regenerative, and then get back to the original blueprint. Again, we've talked about this over and over. As always, we're going to build on what the Bible reveals, but we'll come to see that true whole grains given by God are not only thoroughly documented through human history as an all-important fuel source for man and beast alike, many of the beasts that we eat, but they were in fact the bedrock of empires, which rose and fell in many cases based on their ability to cultivate and control grain production. And what's more, you're going to learn how the best part of the grain is not the gluten and the carbs. It's actually only 10% of the grain, and this comes from heirloom beyond organic sources. The blessing of the time that we live in is that you can actually get concentrated amounts of these nutrients without the accompanying calories that our ancestors actually needed while they were growing and harvesting grain, food for a living. Most people, that was their occupation throughout all of history until very recently. And suddenly, in about half a century, we flipped from being 2% of the population in non-agrarian occupations and 98% of the population farming. And we flipped that, and now less than 2% of the population actually produces the food that we eat. So it's a dramatic shift in a very short period of time. And we might consider that a blessing of convenience, but it's actually led to the largest health epidemics in human history that are killing the most people by far. So remember that the majority of the human population until very recently spent their time moving their bodies and growing food for survival. And modern conveniences pitfalls include the devastation of life-giving grains, among other foods, like I talked about with fruits and vegetables. Give you a lot of practical tips on how to get the most nutrients out of them and make sure you're picking the right ones. And your family doesn't have to suffer the fate of the West any longer. I believe we're going to see in our lifetime the restoration of regenerative agriculture and health through the restoration of this most redemptive food group. But for those of us that grew up on genetically modified processed grains and have a lot of autoimmune conditions and other issues, we live in a time where we're going to have to do a lot of work to supplement and help our bodies heal and restore. And sometimes we're just going to have to avoid some of these things in order to be healthy. But our children don't have to have that same issue if we get this right early on. Now let's move on to grains in the Bible, and we'll start there, and then we'll move on into the history of processing whole grains.
Now the famine had spread across the whole region, so Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Every land came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, for the famine was severe in every land. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you keep looking at each other? Listen," he went on, "I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we will live and not die." Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please, come near me." And they came near. "I am Joseph, your brother," he said, "the one you sold into Egypt." And now, don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt.
I want to take you back to our earlier episode, Food and Redemption. In that episode, it's short, you should go listen to it if you haven't already, but we talked about the story of Joseph and the Israelites in Egypt. And in that story, what happened was there was a severe famine in all the world, the Bible says, went to Egypt to buy grain in order to survive. And this is telling us something practical and true about the nature of this food group. It's the one food group that can survive after it's pulled from its source, unlike fruits and vegetables or unlike an animal when you kill it. It can survive and it has a long shelf life without any modern technology to keep it alive, such as freezing or cooling. Obviously, those things didn't come around until electricity. So grains retain their nutritional value until they are processed. And the ancient process was milling them and then baking them, cooking them in different ways. And these grains survived and protected the nutrients inside. See, that's what a grain is. It's a seed. It's this whole package that protects critical nutrients from the outside world. It's actually a picture of the pre-fall world where we were shielded from harmful rays of the sun and other aspects of the environment that cause aging and decay. The oxygen in the environment was significantly higher in the pre-flood world. We know this through different geological surveys and looking at the concentration of oxygen in bubbles inside of amber. We also know that people would have lived virtually indefinitely before the flood, and they did live for hundreds of years, almost 1,000 years in many cases before the flood. And that's because the environment was protected from things that cause aging, and God intentionally removed those. Well, the grain does the same thing for the nutrients, the life-giving nutrients inside of them, and they stay alive until they are exposed to oxygen and light and other things that cause oxidation or aging. So inside of those grains, there are a broad variety of nutrients, which make them a food that could be consumed exclusively and provide sustenance in perfect form. They have the exact right ratio of protein to carbs to fibers. And these are the ancient grains I'm talking about. They didn't have access to all kinds of fresh fruits and vegetables all the time. I'm sure they ate meat and a lot of other things. But the one thing that they had continuously was their grain supply that they could take. And it would be able to be consumed in all different seasons because once it's harvested until it's processed, it stays the same. And this is where the term daily bread comes from in the Bible. We talk about our daily bread. Give us our daily bread. Why is that significant? Well, every day, the process in the ancient world was to take your whole grain and then to mill it with a stone mill and then to bake it. You add yeast to it or leaven, and you could also add other things to it if you want to look at the recipe in, there's Ezekiel 4:9. In fact, there's a whole brand that built itself off of this scripture passage, even though it doesn't actually contain these important lipids and sterols that I'm going to focus on today. But bread is synonymous with food. You can read through the Bible and you can interchange the word food and bread. There isn't a major distinction because that was the staple food of the world. Now, whole grains have especially important nutrients like microminerals, selenium, zinc, vitamin E. We've got the family of B vitamins, all of these that are essential in order to even conceive life. These are found in the whole grain. And this is how civilizations were able to grow and how they were able to sustain their populations and how they were able to survive in times of famine because they could keep these foods and store them.
Take wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt. Put them in a single container and make them into bread for yourself.
So really important takeaways from just looking at these different illustrations in the Bible. And we just gloss over that because, as I mentioned, most of us aren't farmers. We don't understand the nature of food and growing food, and we live in a world with modern technologies. Now, let me connect grains to some of the other food groups. Raw foods have enzymes, but they need to be chewed thoroughly. In fact, for plants, Our bodies don't make the enzyme that breaks down the cell wall of plants. In animals that exclusively eat plants, particularly things like grasses, they have multiple stomachs. They chew it for a lot longer, so their digestive system is way longer than ours, and they have a different oral setup. But I already mentioned that we're omnivorous. It's very clear that God designed us that way because we have a digestive system and an oral setup that's different from exclusive carnivores and from exclusive vegetarian animals. So we have a body that is designed to consume grains and to get a lot out of them. That's the message that I'm trying to communicate here. Now, raw foods are important, but whole grains in their raw form are also really important. And when you unlock and you open up and you get all those nutrients out of them, you give yourself a really sustainable fuel source. The manna provision is a great example of this. So this is in Exodus where God provides for his people in the desert wilderness a whole grain.
When they measured it by quarts, the person who gathered a lot had no surplus, and the person who gathered a little had no shortage. Each gathered as much as he needed to eat.
And we know that the manna was some type of bread and grain. We don't know exactly what it was. It was something miraculously provided by God. It wasn't something that man grew and harvested. But it was a great picture of what God originally designed for humans, right? He puts man in a garden when he creates them where they just have access to unlimited fresh food every day. He's doing the same thing using this manna in the wilderness for the Israelites, showing them, hey, this is how I can provide for you. And this we know because it couldn't be kept. It spoiled really quickly. And what we know from that is even the perfect thing that God makes, the volatility of the food is directly connected to its sustenance.
Moses said to them, "No one is to let any of it remain until morning." But they didn't listen to Moses. Some people left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. Therefore Moses was angry with them. "For 6 days you will gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none."
If something goes bad quickly, that means it's got a lot of nutrients in it. In fact, we'll find out later on that foods that are processed, animals don't even want to eat them. There was this crazy study where they were starving rats and they gave them Kellogg's cereal, and the rats actually ate the cardboard box before they would eat the cereal because they knew that there was no nutritional value in the cereal. It was their last resort. Okay, so really wild. Now the manna, let me go back to the manna, because Jesus says that he is the manna. He's the bread of life. He was the manna in the wilderness.
Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that anyone may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. The bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh."
It was provided fresh every day. It spoiled quickly, as I mentioned. But some of the other cool aspects of it was that it nourished them and tasted good.
The house of Israel named the substance manna. It resembled coriander seed, was white, and tasted like wafers made with honey.
We read in Exodus 16:31 that it actually tasted good. Again, let's go back to the garden. God provided fresh fruit that looked and tasted good. So the manna is mirroring that. And they couldn't keep it. They found that when they kept it, it would spoil. The only day that it would be kept longer supernaturally was on the Sabbath day. So really amazing aspects of it. We don't know what it tasted like. We just can't remember because we've never been able to reproduce that. We don't know exactly what it was. God didn't give us a recipe, but we know that it was some kind of a grain that tasted really good. Very gracious of God. And of course, he adds meat to that. But what was interesting about the addition of the quail, it was because the Israelites were whining and that they wanted meat and they wanted the taste of meat. It wasn't because the manna was insufficient. So God provides this meat protein form that required the death of quail. He had to send the quail in and they had to kill it and everything. And he does that. And he even makes them sick of it. He says, it's going to be coming out of your nostrils because you've been complaining so much. So there's the provision in the Old Testament, in the wilderness, God or Jesus provides for the Israelites manna and quail. What does Christ provide for the crowds when he feeds the 5,000? And there's another instance where he feeds miraculously thousands of people. So obviously 5,000 men, not including women and children. What does he feed them? He feeds them bread and fish. That's a perfect combination of the most important fats. I told you I was going to mention healthy fats in this episode and in the next one. Well, the two healthiest fats are the group of omega-3, 6, and 9 in their perfect ratio that come in whole grains, and omega-3s from fish, from wild-caught fish. Fish are high in omega-3 fatty acids, which are the key anti-inflammatory for the body. You combine those two things and you have a perfect, sustaining, satiating meal, great for cognitive function, and that would actually sustain you for multiple days after consuming it.
So when Jesus looked up and noticed a huge crowd coming toward him, he asked Philip, "Where will we buy bread so that these people can eat?" He asked this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, so they sat down. The men numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, and after giving thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also with the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were full, he told his disciples, "Collect the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces from the 5 barley loaves that were left over by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This truly is the prophet who has come into the world."
So just to highlight again a few things that we've learned here. Real bread is synonymous with food in Scripture, and that's because it is complex carbohydrates that are a sustainable energy source. We talked about this in our very first episode, our prologue, in fact, where we use the story of Elijah, who runs off of a mountain after doing incredible battle, seeing what God can do. And then all of a sudden, uncharacteristically, he's depressed and he wants to die. He asks the Lord to kill him. And God doesn't respond to him affirming that anything is true about that. He tells him to eat food. You're depressed. You have low blood sugar. You're exhausted. That's connected to your lack of fuel. And God provides for him a loaf of bread, a cake of bread. We don't know exactly what it is. Some speculate that it was barley, which is in the grain family as well. And you can trace this throughout Scripture. It's in the book of Ruth. We read about the barley. We read about this in the time of Judges. And barley is actually one of my favorite grains. It's what the cows that we eat and that we prefer, that we buy from our ranchers, they actually finish them on organic barley. And barley was used to fatten healthy animals. It's a great grain source for animals. So if you often hear, oh, only grass-fed and grass-finished, and that's actually not the optimal tasting and healthy animals. There were animals that just grazed, but the animals that the kings ate and that were considered great in times of abundance were those that were grain finished with the original grains that would have suited their digestive system, again, like barley. And we even read the law in Deuteronomy, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. That tells us that it would have been appropriate for the ox to consume the grain. It wouldn't have been bad for them. The problem with modern grain-fed animals is that the grains we're feeding them are the same trash grains that we're eating. And we're giving them ones that aren't suited to them, like corn and soy. Very different. The areas that corn and soy grew in large quantities in the ancient world were not areas that had significant animals that were the significant ruminant animals that ate lots of grains. Those animals would have eaten other types of grasses that were also available on those continents. So it's an unnatural food source, both for the animals and for us in their genetically modified forms. We can eat corn and soy, some of the biggest populations in the world. In the ancient world, if you can look in the Central and South America, you can also look in Asia, and we find that some of the largest populations in the world survived off of those, and corn and soy happen to be the grains of those areas. We introduced things like wheat in large capacity to North America when it was settled by Europeans.
The church can no longer afford to follow the same patterns as the world in our daily bread. We must be salt and light. The Bible is spiritual food. It ends with a warning not to add or take away from the precise, complete words of prophecy. When one does, as is the practice of every cult, spiritual nourishment can no longer take place. We become spiritually malnourished. It is essential to share the whole counsel of God's will. Quote by Jim McAfee.
We have some really exciting announcements for you guys, but first we want to say thank you to all of those who are new to the Regenerated family via the podcast or meeting us at different events, and especially those of you who have subscribed to our Substack. It's awesome to see new subscribers every day. What do you get for joining our Substack? Well, you'll get our articles, and the first person to get our podcast episode will be someone who's subscribed to our Substack. That'll go straight to your email inbox, or if you prefer, to your inbox on Substack. I love getting stuff that way. In the app, it's really clean, it's really focused. You can actually listen to readings of the articles, and you will get your bonus content as well if you're a paid subscriber there. And you're going to get first access to everything that we put out. If you're interested in joining, you can go to beregenerated.substack.com. And for only $7 a month, we will offer you a lot of additional benefits, including in January, starting a Q&A for our subscribers only. We also have additional bonus content from our main episodes that doesn't make it into those that we wanted to reserve for our subscribers to support you. And we will have special interviews, recipes, and other articles that are only available to subscribers. So if you're interested in joining, go check that out. The link is in the description. If you want to join our mailing list and know the latest of what we're doing with our coaching programs and our meetups and other products that we're producing, then you can go to beregenerated.com and sign up for our email list there. We are really excited to announce that we have some merch available on our website right now. So we have hats. I'm wearing one right now. Those are flying off the shelves. And then we also have Maca mugs. So Make America Christian Again, hats and mugs. We have other things that we're going to be putting out there. We're really excited for that. And lastly, we have several partnerships that are in the work right now, which we are really excited to bring to you. As a matter of fact, I'm traveling this week to go and work on one, and we made a lot of amazing connections at the conference circuit that we did in October, which has kept us really productive the last month and a half. So we're excited to bring those to you in the near future. Some of them will be announced this week, and others will be released over the course of the end of the year into the new year. And this comes from everything from, we'll say, wrecking gear to nootropics to biltong. So if you're excited about getting some special discounts for being part of the Regenerated family, we would love to have you check it out. You can go to beregenerated.com and join our email list to be the first to know. In discussing the state of nutrition in our society today, we have to go back to the history of processed foods. And we're going to start with the most basic staple, which was the first food to be processed, whole grains. See, traditional milling involved grinding wheat, fresh wheat, slowly between stones in order to prevent the heating of the nutrients in the germ and alluron layers of the grain. We're just going to focus on wheat for the sake of this explanation. Now, there in that portion of the grain, which I mentioned is only 10% of the grain, lie high-quality oils, as well as significant amounts of protein, B vitamins. As a matter of fact, when you add the B vitamins that are already in the grain along with yeast, then you get the full complex of B vitamins. This is why MTHFR and B vitamin deficiencies, methylation issues were not a problem for the majority of human history. We also find other nutrients like vitamin E and selenium. These are nutrients that give the grain its life-sustaining sustenance, and they give our bodies the critical elements that we need in order to reproduce and detoxify. You don't have life without these critical micronutrients, and these are, no surprise, the nutrients that we have stripped from our diets today, and we see skyrocketing rates of infertility and inability to detoxify and all kinds of degenerative diseases that are related to a lack of these specific nutrients, which God in his wisdom put into the primary food source of humans for thousands of years. Again, this is only in a small part of the grain, so we're going to look at how we get those nutrients back into our diet, while we might not want the gluten if we have issues that we struggle with, or we might not want the carbs because we live a sedentary lifestyle. Now you can see why such care was taken by people to preserve the integrity of the wheat berry in the milling from flour to bread. Our ancestors knew more about nutrient preservation than the vast majority of moderns do, even with our scientific specificity. And as a result of this disrespect, today's flour is nothing like the whole food goodness that humans were designed to thrive on and that they enjoyed for thousands of years. Fast forward to modern history. Steel rollers were grinding wheat in the 1800s. They were invented in Hungary in 1839. That's where they started to be developed, and they came to the United States in the 1870s. Now, the advent of processing wheat with steel made possible the separation of the wheat germ from the fiber and the starch in order to make white flour. So this end product is then stripped of its essential nutrients, and it has little or no protein value. Most of the heirloom grains are high in protein, with a ratio of protein to carbs to fiber that's ideal for blood sugar and energy, all the things that I mentioned earlier on, which is why it was so important for armies and for large groups of humans. As a result of the nutrient removal, these grains became much less prone to insect infestation. So it seemed to be a blessing. But in fact, the weevils wouldn't even eat them. Now, these are the bugs that often accompanied whole grains and could be found far out at sea in the ship's grain supply. If you've ever seen the movie Master and Commander, there's a great scene in that movie that depicts this. Now, we should have stopped here. And indeed, this did cause concern to man in the industrialization of the West, because it's only common sense that if the bugs won't eat it, it's probably not good for us, or much of the nutrients are gone. What component of the grain is responsible for this adjustment in shelf life? The unprocessed grain berries consist of 10% lipids and sterols, which are essential oils that are required for cellular nutrition. These are the optimal and complete building blocks for human cells. Every lipid bilayer of our cells requires specifically this group of fats to thrive. There's lipids and phytosterols, or plant hormones. But since these high-quality fats oxidize and they rapidly begin to go rancid after the milling of the fresh grain, they're removed from our wheat in order to extend their shelf life, which sounded like a great idea after the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. But historically, bread would only last roughly a day. And this is still the case in some countries that have held onto their traditional grain standards, or if you have spent time milling your own grains. In the age of convenience, we have bypassed the established routine instinctive to human survival, which is grinding, cooking, and eating our daily grains. I'm going to share more on Substack in both free and bonus articles, as well as an audio for our subscribers. But the first chronic disease in the modern world came about as a result of this food destruction. It was called beriberi, which means I can't, and it corresponded to the introduction of processed grains on indigenous populations in the British Empire. Much like the advent of tooth decay, as documented by Price and Pottinger, who I'll talk about in our protein episode, milled flour immediately led to fatigue, weakness, and degeneration. In other words, the first mass chronic disease can be traced right back to this time. In the First World War, we likely had more American soldiers die from an early form of celiac disease due to the processing of bread in the first mass distribution of processed foods for combat MREs. Now, this was blamed on influenza, but in the reality, symptoms were caused by digestive disorders that seemed very similar to flu-like symptoms.
In 2012, shortly after I became a dad, I started having frequent stomach cramps. I had previously had no major health issues. I really ate a pretty typical American diet and lived a moderately active lifestyle. During the course of that year, my digestive health steadily declined. I was losing weight, losing energy, and passing blood. I started battling depression for the first time, really struggling to enjoy or even be interested in my life. Praise God, the Lord sustained me through job loss and moves and toddler tantrums, but honestly, I crawled through most of that. I could barely hold my son or even take a walk with my wife. I could eat no more than really a couple of bites of food and feel totally full. And in 2013, I saw a GI doctor and got an endoscopy and a colonoscopy, which resulted in a Crohn's diagnosis. Apparently, 70% of my colon was diseased, so I was not a candidate to have a piece of my colon removed, which is their usual recommendation. So what they did instead was they started me on a steroid and an oral immune suppressant. At the time, my wife and I were mildly skeptical of the modern medicine model of care, but we felt desperate for some symptom relief. Within a few weeks, I was really feeling somewhat better, but when the steroids ran out and I took the immune suppressants without them, my body took a drastic turn for the worse. I started bleeding internally. I got down to 136 pounds. I could barely eat or even stay awake for very long. No GI doctor at that time had an open appointment for me, and really all they suggested was that I go to the ER to get a blood transfusion. So, by God's grace, we were given the name of a functional medicine doctor, and she was able to see me at the last minute. She ran extensive blood work and discovered my entire body was severely inflamed, which is why I was bleeding internally. I had scarring on my heart, I had hypertension, I was borderline diabetic. Basically, all of my organs were struggling to function. So this functional medicine doctor checked my food allergies and diagnosed me with celiac disease, which means I had both celiac and Crohn's. She believed it was possible for me to heal, though she did admit she had never seen anyone who had Crohn's and celiac and wasn't on medication. We started learning about reducing inflammation through food and supplements and reducing stress. It was a drastic lifestyle change, but we did it together. We did it slowly. We didn't do everything all at once. We took it step by step, focusing on one thing at a time. Every week we saw improvement, and within a couple months, by God's grace, I could play outside with my son again. I finally got in to see a GI doctor who told me I needed a stronger immune suppressant infusion, which is a medication called Remicade. And he told me, quote, "Diet has nothing to do with this disease," end quote. Needless to say, that was the first and last time we saw that GI doctor. So by the end of 2014, I was back to about 70 to 80% doing yard work and generally feeling mostly like myself, but keeping a strict whole foods and gluten-free diet. There were obviously setbacks and adjustments we made often as we checked in on my blood work, but in 2 years, my blood work was perfectly clean and healthy. And because of that, I stopped seeing my doctor altogether. So fast forward to 2020. We were able to incorporate kamut flour, which is an ancient whole grain that's not sprayed with glyphosate, into our daily diet with no negative effects. Slowly, since then, I have found freedom to enjoy all food groups, and honestly, even some less than ideal quality foods when there's no other choice. Though we do stick to a generally organic, high-quality diet. I'm maintaining my weight at about 160 to 170 pounds, hiking with my family, and generally feeling joy and peace. This was a hard journey, but it was one that God used to grow me closer to Him, to make my wife stronger, my kids stronger, and ultimately our family stronger. Not just through health, but also in our walk with God.
For more on this, subscribe to our Substack, but there's all kinds of stories in history that can be traced to the advent of processed foods, which itself led to disease because of the removal of nutrients in the food. In fact, this will really blow your mind, but there was a study that was done. It was nearly a 30-year meta-analysis. I'll tell you who funded the study in just a minute. But the conclusion of this worldwide study of nutrient deficiencies in disease was that not that disease was killing us. It's not that we needed more vaccines for areas that have infectious disease. The conclusion of all of this was that what we aren't eating is killing us, that missing nutrients in our diets are leading to early death and disease. This is the top cause of death around the world. Now, again, this was a meta-analysis of many different studies over the course of about 30 years, and it was collaborated and put out by the Bill Gates Institute in conjunction with several other organizations. And the research that they found didn't support their claims that they need to invent genetically modified foods to help with starvation, or that they need to create some new food that has nutrients that weren't already there. Their research didn't support, again, the need to mass vaccinate populations because infectious disease isn't anywhere close to the deadliness of chronic disease. What they found were these specific nutrient groups are being removed from our food, and that's leading to early death. These nutrient groups included, wait for it, whole grain extracts. Now, this study looked at countries that are still consuming a lot of carbohydrates. So that clearly isn't the function of the grain that's missing. They also came to the conclusion that we're missing really healthy fats from nuts and seeds, original ones, not the genetically modified hyper-processed versions, of course, but also fruits and vegetables. It was whole grain oils, fruits and vegetables, and then nuts and seeds, and going down the list. As the world has progressed, we've increased our protein consumption. But again, the health of that is tied to the types of animals that we're eating and the health of those animals. What are they consuming? And most of them are consuming these same processed grains. Really amazing study that I want to thank the Bill Gates Institute for putting out and showing us that nutrition and lack of specific nutrients is the leading cause of death, not the things that we shut the world down for. Now, fast forward several decades, we're picking back up on the processing of grains. And ultra processing became ubiquitous. In 1941, we began enriching refined flour with certain minerals and nutrients, again, because the bread's utter inability to sustain life became apparent. And for the past 80 years, we've maintained this degradation of the most beneficial foods known to man, continuing to do the same with our other macros, from fats to antioxidants to protein. I mentioned this in the last episode. We have destroyed these good foods in order to make them last on the shelf or to produce some food byproduct that doesn't have the original nutrients. And we wonder why we have malfunctions. The farce is in the marketing of enrichment, or the adding back of a sparse few synthetic nutrients in order to legally call this new fake food a whole grain. In fact, the common whole wheat products that we get today need only derive of 50% of their ingredients from a grain origin in order to be lawfully labeled whole grain. So this is a complete marketing scam. And they're mostly genetically modified and hyper-hybridized strains in the United States. Now, people will often report that when they go to Europe and they consume these same things, and it's not necessarily that they're whole grain or that they're unprocessed, that they feel better and they can have a lot of the foods they can't have in the United States. And this is because of the genetic modification, hybridization, and the addition of all of these other toxic chemicals and ingredients that really mess up our digestive system in the United States for really no good reason. And the question right now is this intentional to make us more sick, to make us a product for the sick care industry, or is this intentionally done to make us fertile, or is this simply done out of malevolence or for other reasons? We don't know, and there's really no conclusion other than malevolence, considering that these same companies that make products for their own countries, or when the product is made to be sent to another country that has human natural standards, they don't have all these other ingredients. Now back to the whole grains. They aren't whole by God's standard, as the manufacturer would have you believe, these things that say whole grain on the label. And this is what's led to the mistrust of grains and people being against grains. Are we really supposed to trust that sugary breakfast cereals have our daily value, whatever that is, of whole grains to the extent the packaging markets? This is another reason I'm absolutely floored that we have a potential Health and Human Services Secretary in RFK who's going after the deceptive industries that have a stranglehold on our health with lies sold to us from the time of our birth, literally from the time of our birth. It's better for you to give your child this genetically modified infant formula than it is for them to nurse off of their own mother. Now, how do we get the healthy fats from these grains if everything is processed? And what if we want to eat the real deal? This is the question that I posed at the beginning. Do you want to get back to the real deal? So there's two steps. One is pretty short and the other is going to be a little bit more broad. But the first one is to avoid. Avoid. I'm quoting again from the biblical nutritionist, or actually I'll hand this over to my wife.
Quoting the biblical nutritionist. Nothing beats the taste and quality of warm, freshly baked bread. Bread reminds us of numerous events during the time of Jesus, such as when he multiplied loaves to feed the hungry, the breaking of bread during the Last Supper, and he also said, "I am the bread of life." Today, there are dozens of types of bread, and not all of what is in the ingredients list are even worth consuming, such as additives, preservatives, and so much more. If bread has white flour instead of whole grain flour, you're better off without it. This type of flour is basically void of good quality nutrients, and the only reason there's some flavor in bread made of white flour is because of the tons of sugar and additives to it. By steering clear of white flour and milling your own flour, you're sparing yourself from the possibility of consuming rancid flour that increases toxicity in the body, among other serious health consequences.
Now, step 2, we want to introduce. Eating today's whole grains, a person would have to consume at least 800 calories more if you have hormonal disorders of quality wheat, brown rice, or let's say soy. I'll do an aside on soy because there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. For good reason, but we need to understand what real soy is and why it was so important to some of the healthiest countries in the world. Maybe not right for you, but I'll have a secondary audio on that you can check out on our Substack. Soy is considered a grain, by the way, and non-GMO soy is one of the most high protein foods, sustainable foods in the world, which is why some of the largest populations with healthy hormones thrive off of it, although they have the fermented version. So it's the same concept as what we've done to destroy it and genetically modify it with our wheat is the same that's been done to soy. Now, most Americans are not consuming true whole grains since most of us don't know what they are and we don't have a consistent access to the heirloom varietals or the whole wheat form of it. And we don't know how to process that ourselves. We've lost connection to the basic aspect of food that all of our ancestors knew in their daily routine. And while these do not need to be the caloric foundation of our diet anymore, I'm not arguing for the food pyramid in that sense, as the infamous marketing would have us believe, they do have a place in a healthy menu. True whole grains, whole grain rice, as I mentioned, is a great addition to your diet. And actually, the proliferation of sourdough is part of this trend, but even most people aren't using fresh milled flour with the lipids and sterols still in. They're using a less processed form that's primarily a carbohydrate. Now, people may not notice reactions when they switch to something like einkorn flour, but you're still not getting these most important nutrients. So you want to make sure that the best part of the grain is what you're getting back into your diet, not merely the less processed version. This is also true of organic pastas, which might be from a source like einkorn, or spelt. Spelt's a great source. But if these have a long shelf life, then the best parts, these healthy oils that oxidize, are gone. And removal of the germ core of the wheat is directly linked to nutritional depletion of human foods in a nation where we often feed our animals better than ourselves. In fact, when these nutrients were first processed out, they weren't thrown away, but they were given to animals, which for a short time helped them grow stronger on healthy fats in concentrated amounts. But we have since turned to genetically modified low-quality processed grains like corn and soy for our animals, which means that if you're eating conventional animals as the foundation of an animal-based diet, then you are still getting lots of rancid grain products into your diet, and you're negatively impacting your cells, your body on the cellular level. As it breaks these things down, it has to look for these substances, and if you don't provide them, then your body will use inferior fats for your cell membranes. These deviations with grain were the first of many reckless departures away from whole food integrity. So what should you introduce, or what should you switch to? Get towards more original, easier to digest grains. Many people who go to Europe, as I mentioned, when they're not eating the same strains as they are in the United States, they feel better. And this is due to them being non-genetically modified, not having those toxic additives that cause bloating and digestive destruction that I said. If you have severe issues with gluten, you should probably avoid grains altogether for a season and only supplement with the oils from the grains. I'll talk about that in a minute, until your tight junction and your microbiome can heal. If you want to know more about the tight junction and the microbiome, we have some great resources on digestive health. But this can actually be done very rapidly with the right clinical concentrated nutrients. And you want to get them in easier to digest forms. So typically non-wheat alternatives are the best. Start with whole grain rice. Wild rice is probably the best, but they do have less of these healthy fats and these healthy oils because the bigger the grain, the more oils it has in it. They're easier to break down though, which is why rice is currently the most prolific grain in the world. Even many places that had whole grains, whether it's corn or soy, they also added rice. For additional Western grains, we could look primarily, I said einkorn earlier, but others like spelt and barley are also beneficial. And anything that's more organic and less hybridized is going to be your friend. Einkorn is king. It's the wheat that Jesus ate. It's the wheat of Egypt that the Romans obtained and relied upon for their legions to conquer the world. It only has 2 chromosomes compared to the 18 plus from all the grains that we have that are commonly consumed. You can purchase einkorn or einkorn products directly from Italian companies. Jovial is a really big one. You can get it on Amazon or in most stores. And there are a number of granaries now in the United States, though, providing it as this grows in popularity. We'll link to some of the ones that we're researching and that we trust in our Substack article. And of course, it's best that you get a real grinder in order to process them. If you use an electric stone grinder, this is on my wife's Christmas list, then you can mill the berries yourself without damaging them. It's electric, but it uses the stones instead of the steel. And it gives you that whole wheat. You can also purchase a hand grinder, or you can blend the farro. Another name for the wheat berries is farro. And you can cook them like rice. But if you blend something in a blender like a Vitamix, just know, again, with those steel blades spinning at high speeds, that they are going to damage some of these nutrients so that it won't last as long. Slow and steady wins the race with grains. That's what we can learn from history. Now for supplementation. Clinical research on the side effects of refined grains were first conducted at Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital in Southern California in 1946, where the women were showing no response to medical treatment for insufficient hormone function and chronic fatigue due to their glandular failure. It's a common medical condition today, but it wasn't at this time. Now, mind you, this was before the takeover of the pharmaceutical industry at large. Back then, we were 60 years at least before the invention of the cellular microscope, where we could actually see the lipid bilayer. So we didn't understand the body and how it used these nutrients on the cellular level, but we immediately knew the effects of consuming processed grains. And methods for extracting vitamin E from wheat germ, rice, and soya husks had recently been pioneered. These omitted oils contain not only vitamin E, lipotropics, and lecithin, but the perfect ratio of unsaturated fatty acids, those aforementioned phospholipids and phytosterols. Now, I'll give you at least one teaser for what we don't have time to cover here, but octocosanol. Octocosanol is an amazing component of these whole grain oils, and there was a really awesome study done on Navy SEALs showing how this provided more oxygen and more energy to their cells, that they were able to take longer strokes underwater before they had to come up for a breath, which would obviously be really important in a tactical situation. Altogether, Tre-en-en grain concentrates are what we're looking at. Now, Tre-en-en is the name that was given by the man who discovered these. It's the Greek word meaning 3-in-1. The hospitals used these high-quality fats, which the inventor called Tre-en-en. And when I say inventor, he was just getting these cold-pressed processed grain oils and putting them in a concentrated form to be used as the world's first nutraceutical in this study. The hospital used them and they gave them to the women, and they saw that their body chemistry significantly improved within just a couple weeks. The adrenal exhaustion that the women had, the PMS, and glandular failure were all brought into balance as their estrogenic activity went up over 300%. As a woman, you want your estrogenic activity to be high, and as a man, you want your testosterone activity to be high. Men and women have both, but it's the presence of testosterone or estrogen that make us men and women. The conclusion was that these essential oils, linoleic, alpha linoleic, omega-3, omega-6, and 9, and especially phytosterols, these all support basic cell function. This series of studies, along with many others that followed, this was the initial one, indicated that people were suffering from chronic fatigue and that they could benefit dramatically from the mixture of whole food plant extracts, provided that these were healthy grains or legumes. Legumes also have some of these oils, and that they had the broad spectrum of these nutrients, which basically every grain, every civilization, you can go back and look at them relying on a staple whole grain or grains around the world. And they all have these nutrients to a greater or lesser degree. Now, Tre-en-en contains a natural balance of important omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids that is anti-inflammatory. And these powerful sterols, beta-sitosterol, gamma-oryzanol, sesmasterol, campesterol, and octocosanol I mentioned. Those are all the different hormones that can be made from these whole grains that are in those foods. And what your body does is it takes these nutrients and uses amino acids to convert them to human hormones. And each one of the trillions of cells in our bodies is like a tiny machine that's consistently at work. No matter their specific function, cells require critical nutrients to serve their purpose optimally, lest they become sluggish and inefficient. All the energy produced in one's body on a daily basis happens at the cellular level. If cells are not able to do their job effectively, then one's energy levels drop, producing an exhausted and drained feeling. Without the necessary components for proper construction, the body makes inferior structures. A decrease in essential fatty oils and an increase in saturated fats produces a quickly deteriorating body from the inside out. This is what cellular nutrition is. You don't start with your organs or your tissues, you start with the nutrition in your cells. You need to be able to sustain energy, and you don't want to be prone to regenerative disease, usually associated with old age. So how can we produce more energy effectively at the cellular level? You could look at supplementing with these nutrients. If you were to introduce a supplement more important than a vitamin or a mineral, it would be these whole grain lipids and sterols, for the exact reason that I mentioned. Because if you want to get those vitamins and minerals into your cells, if you want to get more out of the food and supplements that you're already taking, you need these nutrients. And what's crazy is that still today, there's only one purveyor of these whole grain extracts outside of you eating the whole grains themselves, even though this information has been out there for decades. So it's vital that we reintroduce the necessary nutrition to our cells, lipids and sterols from plant extracts that are in a bioavailable form, cold pressed from original strains, not genetically modified. And many chronic diseases, typically considered incurable because of the rise in the unperceived cause. This is why we have terms like chronic fatigue to describe these symptoms, or beriberi, if you go back in history. They can be significantly reversed through the supplementation with the right whole foods. As the oft-quoted father of modern or Western medicine stated, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." We need to look towards food to give us the foundational ability to heal our bodies. It's not medicine in the strict sense, but your body can't heal if it doesn't have the nutritional building blocks. For this reason, whole grains should be the foundation of any healthy diet. And this aspect of the whole grains should be the foundation, not the gluten, not the carbs. This is proven by science, and it verifies what we can look at in history and what we can look at in biblical nutrition, the key regulatory function of cellular nutrition, energy, and hormones. These are the chief building materials of healthy cells. So let's look at lipids and sterols. Now, we're firmly in the camp of high protein, high antioxidant, heritage whole food consumption. We've already talked about this in our biblical nutrition episode. And we're on the Make America Healthy Again train. In fact, I've been on this track for 15 years since I had my eyes open. I previously detailed how I was in the pit of despair with chronically low testosterone, prediabetes, excess body fat. I also had sinus congestion, food intolerances, joint pain, many of the typical symptoms of your standard American. And I bring this up because rightly understanding this particular macro and introducing it into my life, along with complete amino acids, this changed my life. It's a category that's critical to accurately identify and fix our bodies and, in fact, our entire food and agricultural system. This is the preventative measure to fix our flawed understanding of disease treatment, starting with cellular nourishment and getting the right nutrients, human natural nutrients, beyond organic. Everything begins with nutrition, and by nutrition, we mean cellular nutrition, what's human natural with creational integrity in the order of food by God's design. We'll pick up in our next episode more on healthy fats and protein in the meat provision. Thanks for joining this episode of Be Regenerated. We hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, that you include many different healthy whole foods, and that you look to the original forms that God created. If you want to know more about these healthy lipids and sterols, you can check out our Substack, or you can reach out to us directly. And we do a free discovery call. I do a lot of coaching where I introduce these nutrients back into your diet and help your family get on the right track with your health. We can see amazing turnarounds in our men, our women, in fertility, and our children even by reintroducing these, and I would love to help you out. Thanks for listening to Be Regenerated. We'll see you on the next episode.
And that wraps up today's episode of Be Regenerated. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date, don't forget to join our Wisdom Weekly email through our podcast page. Also, your support means the world to us, so if you have a moment, please hit the stars on your listening platform. It really helps us reach more people who can benefit from these discussions. And if you're interested in joining a community of like-minded men striving for holistic health and strength, check out the Be Regenerated Brotherhood at beregenerated.com/brotherhood. It's an exciting platform designed to challenge and support you in your fitness, nutrition, and spiritual disciplines. We also appreciate your support through our partnership with Neolife for top-notch supplements. You can find all the links and details in the show notes. God bless, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. So, whatever you eat or drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God.